Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Tim Clutton-Brock. He's professor in the Department of Zoology at Cambridge University. He is known for his comparative studies of the behavioral ecology of mammals, particularly red deer and meerkats. He works in three main areas: the evolution of vertebrate breeding systems, population regulation and the control of population stability in large mammals, and natural and sexual selection in natural populations. So Dr. Clutton-Brock, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, so today we're going to focus mostly on mammals and mammal society. So how far back in evolutionary history do we need to go to find the first societies, or what we could call societies?
Well, that obviously very much depends on what you call societies, as you're right. So the first life appeared probably around 4 billion years ago, with the prokaryotes, very simple unicellular organisms without a nucleus, around 3.5 billion years ago. Yeah, and they tended, some of them certainly aggregated. So if by a society you mean an aggregation of independent reproducing units, you're looking at a very long history indeed. The first multicellular animals and the first multicellular organisms, I should have said, somewhere around 3 billion, 3.5 billion. And in a sense, the collection of cells within a single body is a society itself. Depends again how you think about societies. The first animals, somewhere around 650 million years ago. So once you've got animals, you've got mobile units that can propel themselves around, and they can aggregate or disperse and so on. So that it's not a simple question to answer there. It's a gradual process of the evolution of independent reproducing units into more complex units and more complex units. So you could argue that there are societies at different levels. And I suspect you're really wanting to know when do you see the first animal societies?
Right.
I mean, plants have societies in a sense too. They tend to aggregate with other members of the same species. I suspect you're interested in animal societies. That probably goes back right to the origin of animals at around 650 million. So a long time.
So from an evolutionary perspective, what are the benefits and costs of living in a society or being part of a social species?
Well, I'm basically by aggregating and aggregate, if I'm looking at society in the simplest way as an aggregation of individuals that are commonly from the same species or the same genetic groups. And in most cases, aggregation, or in many cases, aggregation assists in competition. So you're getting aggregating units associating with each other to compete with others. If you look at clumps of lichens on a rock, for example, you find actually that they have little black boundaries, and you've got groups of lichens that are competing with each other, and they're taking each other over, and so on. The same, you get the same sorts of things with many other spatial organisms. You get it with plants as well as with animals. Aggregations of the same species start competing with other aggregations of the same species to give them the heave-ho, to take over more resources themselves. And cooperation, association and cooperation is, in a sense, it's moving up the level of competition. So if you think of the original sort of free moving, non-mobile, drifting reproductive units in the primordial soup, they just drifted around. But once they got onto, there would have been better resources and worse resources. And if you aggregate round a resource, you can occupy the resource and thus do better than individuals that are just floating freely. So aggregation helps competition. It commonly assists in either finding or locating or staking a claim to food. So animal groups commonly compete for food. In many cases, as you move up to vertebrates and to homeotherms, aggregation helps to maintain heat, particularly in winter. So quite a lot of the animals that hibernate, quite a lot of the mammals that hibernate, for example, hibernate in groups because that grouping helps to hold temperature. Once you're at this level, then aggregation and the formation of social groups is commonly useful in keeping predators at bay. Groups can defend themselves, individuals can learn, can identify the identity of predators, can teach that to their children. By grouping together, they can benefit from the information they derive from other individuals. They can alert each other to predators and so on. And finally, grouping commonly is important to reproduction. So the groups commonly help to, in some cases, in some species, they help to rear each other's offspring. In many cases, they protect them, and groups become group territorial. So they maintain, so groups of males in some cases defend breeding access to groups of females. Groups of females may bunch and help each other if males are attacking them or males are attacking from another group. So it's typically a mixture of benefits in relation to competition and benefits in relation to cooperation relative to the broader environment. Does that give you the kind of answer you were wanting, or is that much too unspecific?
Well, we're going to talk about some of those aspects of sociality that you mentioned later on. But first, let me ask you, do we need group selection to understand how different animal societies evolve, or can we simply look at evolution at the level of individuals?
That's a complex question which people are where there's a lot of debate. I think it's obviously the case that there are differences between groups, and the groups are in competition, and that some groups die out and others are maintained. So Darwin's original explanation of the evolution of sociality in insect societies, in eusocial insects, where you get a queen that does most of the breeding and then a whole pile of her children that look after the babies. Darwin pointed out that this was effectively selection between families. Now, whether you choose to look at that, a selection between queens basically control, or in many of the cases, they exert extensive control over the workers. And queens that control their workers may do better, and they may breed better, and the societies may do better. So you can think of that, if you wish, as selection operating at the group level, but they're all relatives, or they're almost all relatives too. So you could alternatively think of that as selection operating extensively on queens to help produce relatives. I think so that's the case, the sort of original case of social insects. You certainly get some groups dying out as you move to groups of unrelated individuals. The immediate issue there is that since you're dealing with unrelated individuals, their evolutionary interests are commonly divergent. They don't all share the same interests. They may want different things within the groups. They'll often compete with other individuals in the same group. So you don't have the same degree of the alignment of interests. Now, while it's the case that some groups persist and are maintained and others don't, it's also the case that natural selection is pegging away at individuals within the group. And the rate at which groups go extinct is much lower than the rate at which individuals die or breed and survive. So I think the basic answer to your question is individual selection is a much more powerful mechanism under virtually all circumstances than group selection. Group selection may sometimes occur, and it quite commonly occurs in parallel with individual selection. But what you see when you're looking at individual adaptations with animals, which is in a sense where we're getting to, what animals do, how they're formed, how they reproduce, and so on, you seldom see there, I think, adaptations that benefit groups which do not benefit individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you're looking at animal adaptation and animal and social adaptations generally, you're in practice looking at circumstances, looking at adaptations, at traits that benefit individuals rather than groups. And there are quite a lot of things that individuals do which are not good for the group. So, for example, in quite a lot of primates, males, when they get to a breeding group, they get to a new breeding group, they move around and kill any dependent babies. And that advances the next estrus period of the females, and so increases their mating success. Now that's good for the males, but it's obviously not good for the group, and it's not good for the species. So what you find commonly under a lot of circumstances is selection between individuals within groups, operating in a contrary way to what you would perceive as the evolutionary interests of the group or species.
Mm-hmm.
So it's on that basis that I'm trying to give you a general answer to that, and saying, well, yes, we do get selection operating between groups, and this is particularly powerful when everyone is close kin and there's a considerable alignment of interest. But in many cases, there's little alignment of interest. You're dealing with unrelated individuals who are competing with each other. And that competition, the interests of individuals under those will usually win out in relation to the interests of the group. So I think it's useful generally to see animal social life as a product of individual selection rather than group selection.
Mm-hmm.
You have, just to add one extra thing there, you have to be clear about what individual interests are, because individuals' interests are obviously commonly survival, they're obviously breeding success, but in some cases it goes beyond that. And as Hamilton pointed out, individuals can gain fitness, or rather the genes that they hold can gain replication benefits if individuals assist or do other things for relatives. So I mean, you can express this at an individual level, you can express it as a genetic level. But if you think about an individual's success as the extent to which it proliferates its genes into following generations, it can either do that by breeding, or it can do it by helping individuals that carry the same genes. So there's a distinction here that evolutionary biologists draw between direct fitness, producing your own offspring into the next generation, and what's called indirect fitness, which is operating through relatives that share the same genes.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense to you?
Yes, and that would involve mechanisms like kin selection, correct?
That would be kin selection, yes. Kin selection is the term. It's kin selection that operates through indirect fitness. There are various other sort of technical areas where indirect fitness occurs, which you might not call it kin selection, but by and large, yes, kin selection and indirect fitness are the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So since we're focusing on mammals, are there aspects of the sociality of mammal species that we find across all mammal species and that distinguish them from other animals?
So yes and no. I mean, there are characteristics of mammals that define mammals, and the most obvious is lactation.
Mm-hmm.
So all mammals lactate to their young, and one of the consequences of that is that all mammals show some form of parental care. So with birds, you get females in some species laying eggs in mounds where they're heated by the mound. There's no form of direct parental care apart from the production of eggs. With mammals, you always get female care, and that ties in females to the need to care for their young. You can't get them producing very young offspring, very young neonates, and leaving it to males to look after. So you do with eggs, with quite a number of birds and fish, particularly amphibia and particularly fish. Males look after clutches of eggs, which the females lay in a nest prepared by the male, and the male does everything that's necessary for the eggs as they hatch. The reliance of mammals, the ubiquity of lactation, means that females are tied into parental care. Yeah, so you don't get situations where males are the exclusive caregivers, and that has various consequences for for patterns of competition. So you tend not to get, as you in a number of insects, in quite a number of fish, you get males defending a nest site and defending that aggressively and trying to attract females to the nest site to lay eggs there, and then the male looks after the lot. With mammals, you're much more likely to get mobile males going out guarding females, going out and finding receptive females and mating with them, and so on.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, would you say that parental investment is an important factor in how different animal societies develop?
Absolutely. Parental investment is looking after your young instead of just producing eggs, which are looking after your young increases their survival, it increases their growth and their eventual breeding success. So what you're doing but it also limits the number of eggs you can produce, the number of potential new offspring that you can produce. So if you go in for parental care, you're accepting a limit on the number of offspring that you can produce. You can't produce thousands of offspring in a short time because you're going to look after them. It increases the capacity of the offspring to gain resources and to survive under competition from other members of the same species or under adverse environmental conditions. So in a sense, what parental care is about is producing fewer offspring which individually have a higher chance of breeding success.
Mm-hmm. And does the sociality of a given species have anything to do with their preferred mating system?
I have vague problems with a preferred mating system because no one goes around asking animals what mating system they prefer. Mating systems are commonly a consequence of the conflicting, of the divergent intra-evolutionary interests of males and females. So males are out to maximize the number of females they fertilize in many cases, and females are out in many cases to maximize the resources or the access to resources that males provide for them, or in some cases to maximize the extent to which males help them to rear their offspring. So sociality, yes, does affect breeding systems in a big way, because and here I think what you have to do is to think about the sexes separately. So if females are social, if females aggregate in groups, as they do in quite a lot of mammals, what that means is that a male can guard a whole group of females. Mm-hmm. So if you have females, say in groups of 10, that means that a successful male can guard breeding access to a group of 10 females. with the result that there are, if there's an equal sex ratio in the population, there are 9 other males who don't get anything.
Right.
Now that then generates competition between males. So female sociality tends to lead in the animal world to polygamy, to polygyny in particular, breeding systems, mating systems where one male breeds with multiple females, or if groups are very big, cases where there are multiple males per group breeding with multiple females. In that situation, it's quite common that both sexes will breed with multiple partners, which is a system we call polygynandry. Both sexes have multiple partners. So female sociality lies at the core of the factors that influence male competition. And the extent to which males compete with each other to breed for females strongly affects selection on their characteristics. So in the sort of classical cases like red deer that I've worked on, or elephant seals, where an individual male can hold a harem, a substantial harem of 20 or 30 females and keep other males away, that generates intense competition between males, and that intense competition generates selection for weaponry, for teeth in some cases, for antlers in others, for big hind legs in the kangaroos that they use. The precise form of weaponry depends on the way in which males compete. And it commonly generates selection for increased size, so in males. So it's in these species that males are considerably bigger than females. So if you look at elephant seals, males are nearly twice the length of females and are 5 or 6 times as heavy as females. Similarly with red deer. So the extent to which the sexes differ in body size, the biggest differences in the size of males relative to females are in strongly polygynous societies. And if you track that back, that's associated with some form of sociality. So if you find situations where, as in quite a lot of mammals, females hold separate ranges, so each female has a range, that usually restricts the number of females that single males can breed with. Yeah. And that doesn't remove the possibility of polygyny, but it means that the capacity of the system, the extent of polygyny in the systems is likely to be much smaller because males can't guard access to as many females. Doesn't mean to say necessarily that there's no intrasexual competition occurring in males. So you get, for example, bears, where females have individual ranges, males wander more widely, searching for females and breeding with them. You get quite a substantial degree of polygyny and quite a substantial difference in size between the sexes. But the aggregation of females in social groups intensifies competition between males under many circumstances.
Right. So do we know why different species have different ways of structuring their societies in terms of philopatry? Because there are species that are male philopatric, others that are female philopatric. I mean, could you explain that?
Well, I've argued with mammals that this is related to the probability of the need of females to avoid close inbreeding. Now, what's known is that inbreeding with first order relatives, your full sibs or your mother and father, is a seriously bad idea. Inbreeding, even at lower levels, carries substantial costs because individuals are more likely to be homozygous and deleterious recessives are likely to show up. And almost in all populations where individuals normally avoid breeding with close relatives or seldom breed with close relatives, there are substantial costs to breeding success and survival of inbreeding. Inbreeding is bad for your commonly for your fecundity. It's commonly bad for the survival of your children and the longevity of your children. So inbreeding is generally something that animals want to avoid. Now, what we found with mammals looking at it is that in the great majority of mammals, females tend to remain in the group, in the breeding group that they were born in. That obviously makes sense because dispersing, leaving your usual range, leaving the individuals that you've grown up with, carries enormous risks in most mammal populations. It carries risks in terms of competition with neighbors. It carries risks in terms of feeding, of problems of finding food in unfamiliar environments, carries risks in terms of predation and so on. So no one in mammal societies, in animal societies generally, no one disperses lightly. Dispersal is something in general that you want to avoid, but you also need to avoid inbreeding. And what we found in the case in the majority of group living mammals, so I'm talking about cases where females are actually living in groups with males that defend the groups. In many of these species, females remain in their natal groups, but they avoid breeding with they avoid breeding with familiar or unrelated males. So they avoid breeding with their father or their brothers that they've grown up with. And in these societies, males emigrate soon after they reach sexual maturity, and they go and try to find a group without males or displace males from another group. So that's the commonest situation in mammals. But there are a minority of mammals, including all three of the African great apes, chimpanzees, the two species of chimpanzees and gorillas, where females normally leave their breeding group soon after sexual maturity. And that's also the case in some of the social equids, in the case in a number of bats. It's a minority of species where females normally leave. And the species where females leave are ones that appears to be where males or groups of related males have unusually long periods of breeding tenure in their group. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that their tenure is sufficiently long that it's longer than the age at which females get to breed for the first time. So they are species where females need to leave to avoid, to find unrelated partners. So you have a minority of species with long male tenure, which is unusual in mammals, probably because in most mammals, as I've told you, there's strong competition between males. And that strong competition between males shortens the breeding lifespan of males. So if you look at red deer and elephant seals and all these strong polygynous species, males have much shorter breeding lifespans than females. In some cases, it's only males only breed for 2 or 3 years. And obviously the short breeding lifespans allow females to remain in their natal group without ending up in a group where their father is still the breeding male. Females can consequently remain and breed in the natal group, avoid breeding with closely related males, and males then disperse and new males immigrate in. But under circumstances in species where males have unusually long tenure in the breeding group, females have to leave. And in those species, quite commonly males, not in all of them, but in quite a number of them, males may remain and breed in their natal groups. Mm-hmm. So you typically get one sex dispersing. And in mammals, it's usually the case that it's the dispersing sex are males and the philopatric sex are females. As I say, in a minority of species, it's the other way around, where females disperse, males stay. And in those species, male tenure is usually long, and it appears usually to be longer than the age at which females start to breed. And just to say one final thing, I've been talking about philopatry as remaining in the natal group. There are quite a lot of other animals where both sexes disperse. So for example, in quite a lot of pair-living species, both males and females disperse from their parents' territory, and they may go different distances. In some cases, males go further, and in some cases, females go further. Now, some people refer to that as philopatry. I've been talking very much about the structure of groups and using philopatry to refer to cases where you actually remain in the group you're born, not to refer to how far away from the group you move. Mm-hmm. So one has to be a bit careful with thinking about just what do you mean by philopatry, because different people mean different things by philopatry.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and do we know why different animal species have different, let's say, social arrangements, like, for example, multi-male, multi-female groups, one male, multi-female groups, and possibly others?
Well, first thing is, I mean, you've used the term arrangements. No one arranges that. That's okay. That's the outcome. It's you don't get an animal group saying, this is the arrangement for this society. This is the social norm, and that's what comes to it. You basically, you get, if females are aggregated, but the groups are quite small, they're commonly defended during the breeding season at any rate by a single male. If female groups get very big, then commonly you have multiple males because one male can't keep the others out. And if you look at it, it's commonly, I've told you that males that hold large harems tend to have relatively short periods of breeding because the competition on them is so intense that someone rolls up and kicks them out. If you try and hold 100 females, if you can imagine it, there are 99 males waiting to kick you out. So you've got an immense power of competition, which is giving individuals the shove out. Now, so you don't get harems that size, but even if you're trying to keep 9 other males at bay, you're having to work pretty hard to do that. And by sharing the access to females with another male, you're actually prolonging your tenure. So if you think of males as trying to maximize their lifetime breeding success, they need to maximize not just their breeding success per year, but their breeding success over a number of years. And that's why I think you quite commonly find multiple males where you get relatively big groups of females. And going to the other extreme, why do you get a small number of species where males and females have quite distinct territories. So males are not allowed inside, individual males and individual females occupy different feeding territories. And those are cases where there's usually intense competition for particular food resources, which keep the sexes actually apart for most of the year, apart from their breeding. And you get a substantial number of species which are pair living, where a male and a female share territories like that. Now, we don't understand, those species are quite widely dispersed in mammals, so they're taxonomically, you get them in quite a wide range of different species. We don't well understand the distribution of pair living, but the tendency would be to suggest that it's something to do with competition for resources and food between females, which actually keeps the females separate, causes the females not to tolerate other females in that range, and the situation where it then becomes better for males males are more successful if they guard a single female's territory and maximize her breeding success in successive breeding attempts than if they go out and try and monopolize multiple female ranges. So that the cases where, in these species, where an individual male tries to guard the territories of multiple females in separate areas, they seldom do so for long, because someone occupies, they can only be with one female at one time. and someone else picks up one of their other females while they're associated with a single female. So there's no very good explanation of monogamy, probably something to do with resources and something to do with males, with the strategy of males, how males maximize their breeding success, whether they're more likely to maximize their breeding success by defending a single female for a long period of time than trying to defend multiple separate females. But we don't fully understand that yet.
Mm-hmm.
One final thing, Bean suggested that that as in birds, it may be the case that male care is important. In many monogamous mammals, males help care for the young, so both sexes care for the young. In many cases, as in many of the canids, males help to feed young too. But there are also quite a number of species where males don't contribute directly to the care of young, but they still live in pairs. So there are reasons for thinking that care of offspring by males is certainly not the only cause of pair living, that it may be important in some, but the tendency from reconstructions, it looks as if the evolution of pair living either occurred at the same time as the evolution of male care or preceded it. So that the tendency, I tend to believe that it's commonly the case that male care actually evolved after the evolution of pair living. So if you're going to guard a single female, you can increase your breeding success. A male can increase his breeding success by helping to rear the young, but that it's not the case that selection for males to assist in rearing young is commonly the driving force that leads to pair living.
Mm-hmm. And is sexual division of labor also one aspect that we have to consider when trying to explain the evolution of certain aspects of animal sociality?
Well, sexual division of labor, that's usually a term that's used of cooperative breeders.
Uh-huh.
So it's usually a term that's used of small number of mammals where groups consist of commonly a single breeding female and a single breeding male and a pile of helpers. And in those are the systems that are similar to those of social insects. So in social insects, you get a queen who commonly stores sperm for life. So she mates with a male, holds the sperm, produces lots of masses, thousands of helpers who actually help her rear her young. And under those circumstances, you commonly get a division of labor between breeders, particularly between breeding females and non-breeding females, between breeding females and helpers. As you're switching now to mammals, you don't get anything on the same scale as social insects, but you get a small number of species which are roughly similar to that, where commonly a single female breeds in each group. I'm thinking in particular of things like meerkats would be an example of this, but so are mole rats, so are so are many of the canids, so are one or two primates, including the callitrichine monkeys, where typically one female does most of the breeding, if not all of it, in a group. Many of these cases breed with a single male. And then there are non-breeding helpers that help to rear the young. And under those circumstances, it's commonly the case that the helpers do quite a pile of the work. In some cases, as in the mole rats, the queens actually do rather little digging of tunnels or defense of the territory. They stay and breed, rather like a queen bee stays and breeds rather than going out foraging. And the helpers then go and do what's necessary. They protect the young, they bring food to them in some species. Mole rats, they maintain the tunnel systems that they maintain under the ground, which give them access to the tubers they're feeding on. So you get a division of labor in terms of reproduction in that case. But it's usually the case in the mammalian systems that all the helpers do roughly the same thing. So you don't, whereas in the social insects, you get a division of labor among helpers. So you've got soldiers and foragers and so on. You don't find caste systems of that kind in any of the social mammals.
Mhm. So when it comes to primates, is there something distinctive about primate societies in comparison with other mammals?
Not many. I can't immediately think of anything that occur in terms of social behavior that distinguishes primates from everything else. I can think of some things, so that many primates live in stable groups compared to, say, the ungulates or the cetaceans, where groups are what we call open. So groups of individuals aggregate and they split up, and they're not permanent social units. If you go and watch red deer, the females tend to associate relatives more frequently than with non-relatives. But if you look at a herd of deer, maybe 20 or 30 deer, you see families, you see individuals from different families in there. And those subunits, those associated individuals will break off and they'll go somewhere else and so on. So the groups are unstable, and they're what we call, as I say, open groups. Open in the sense that you can come in or you can leave. Much more commonly among the primates, you get closed groups where group membership is stable over quite periods of time. One sex may commonly immigrate in and individuals may disperse and leave, but the core of the group remains the same for weeks or months at a time, quite different from the normal pattern of ungulates. So primates tend to live in stable groups. They, in contrast to the cooperative breeders, in virtually all the primates, apart from the marmosets and tamarins, it's the case that all females are fertile, all adult females are fertile and breed relatively frequently, breed relatively regularly. So you don't get the same concentration of breeding in a single female as you do in the mole rats or the mongooses or the calatrichine primates, where one female does virtually all the breeding, and other individuals may breed occasionally but don't do so frequently. Almost all the monkeys, thinking about it, are usually produce single young. So there are a small number of primates which produce more than one young, commonly twins, but the great majority of females produce single young. And what that means, if you've got multiple females breeding and they're all producing single young, and particularly if you've got multiple males breeding, you have a situation where the level of kinship between individuals is not very high. It's difficult to get high levels of average kinship within groups unless you have a single female that does most of the breeding, a single male that does most of the breeding with her, and the female producing litters. That's what gives you high coefficients of relatedness between group members. So the production of single young and the polygynous matings reduce levels of kinship between group members. So in chimpanzees, for example, the level of, I should have said, female immigration affects this too. So female immigration will reduce levels of kinship. Where in species that produce single young, which are polygynous, there are multiple breeding females, and there's female immigration like chimpanzees, the average coefficients of relatedness are very, very low. Technical terms, the coefficient of relatedness is about 0.05. In contrast to meerkats, where you have one female doing most of the breeding usually with a single male, and so on. The average coefficients of relatedness are of the order of 0.35 to 0.45. So a very high proportion of the individuals, although they're a full SIBs, a very high proportion are closely related to each other. These are the systems where you get cooperative care. These are the systems where you've got very high levels of average relatedness in the group, where some individuals, some females, cease breeding and spend their time looking after young produced by the dominant female.
Mm-hmm. How do we compare different mammal societies? So let's say that, for example, we study a particular mammal, and can we draw directly inferences regarding to other mammals that we study?
Well, I think so. I think we can, in general, produce patterns of association, so that, for example, if you look at ungulates, if you look at deer and antelope and things like that, the forest-dwelling antelopes, whether they're small like muntjac or whether they're big like a carpi, they're almost all solitary. And when you look at the open country ones living in grasslands and savanna, the great majority of ungulates, they live in groups and they tend to be polygynous. Yeah. So you get simple associations like that. A high proportion of nocturnal species feed alone. There are relatively few nocturnal species that forage in groups. They may sleep together, but they typically forage independently, whereas in the open country, mammals commonly they feed in groups, probably as an adaptation to avoid predation. You find other similar associations. So, for example, with the species that commonly kill, with the carnivores, where individuals commonly kill prey, rely on killing prey larger than themselves, they commonly spend at least part of their time breeding living in groups. So you've got hyenas and lions, particularly wild dogs, that live in groups and commonly rely on prey larger than themselves. Whereas in the smaller carnivores, the smaller felids and so on, smaller cats, which typically kill prey considerably smaller than themselves, they're almost all solitary. So, or live in pairs. So you can see associations between habitat and between diet and between activity patterning and particular forms of social organization across mammals. It's also the case that typically animals that are closely related to each other have similar breeding systems, similar patterns of sociality and similar patterns of care. So if you look at, there are lots of species of muntjac deer, they will commonly have, they all appear to have relatively similar forms of social organization. If you look at the Cercopithecine, the African monkeys, they commonly share common properties too, which are different from those shown by the social lemurs or by the New World monkeys. So both the ecological characteristics that animals share and the phylogenetic history that they share can generate similarities in social systems. And one of the things that people like me are interested in is what are the ecological causes and correlates of contrasts between mammal societies. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question? Does that roughly answer your question?
Yeah, roughly. Okay, so what are the effects that things like variation in population density have on natural and sexual selection?
Well, they can be direct. So it's quite commonly the case that that increasing population density within species generates increased competition for resources. So as population density goes up, many mammal populations are their numbers are commonly regulated ultimately by food availability. So as density increases, more and more individuals starve or get diseases or so on, and then they die, and then that regulates the density. Now, very often in those circumstances, and particularly in polygynous species, where males are fighting it out and are going through an intense period of competition for females, some cases like red deer and elephant seals once a year. So males pack in and they feed very little when they're competing for females during the breeding season, and they may damage each other. And under those circumstances, it's commonly the case that high density and the food shortage in winter generates higher levels of male mortality. So that in quite a number of these polygynous dimorphic species, high population density leads to higher mortality in males relative to females, which in turn generates female biased sex ratios in the adult population. That the difference in survival between males and females isn't just confined to adult males, because in most of those species, males grow faster than females, so they require more food during periods of juvenile living and adolescence. And again, acute food shortage tends to lead to higher mortality in males than females. So that too contributes to a female biased adult sex ratio. As the bias towards females occurs in the adult sex ratio, so the extent of competition between males for breeding opportunities declines, which means that younger males get to breed and the variation between males is reduced. So it's commonly the case, I think, that high density reduces male competition and reduces the intensity, the strength of sexual selection.
Mm-hmm. And so, how do different animal societies regulate the size of their population?
They don't.
Okay.
The size of their population is regulated for them. And there was a thought in the 1960s, there's a famous book that suggested that animals regulate their density to avoid overutilizing their food supplies. And the problem with that, if you think about it, that argument relies on individuals operating for the benefit of the group or population versus their own benefit. In a situation where food is limited, what individual selection is doing is usually to encourage individuals to get more food. An individual that restricted its breeding output for the good of the population or group, the genes behind that would rapidly go extinct. So reduced resources, increased competition for resources commonly generate increased competition between individuals. They don't get them hanging back on breeding. Everyone breeds if they can. So animals very seldom regulate their own population density like that. Their population density is regulated for them by disease or by food availability leading to starvation or by increased predation rates.
Mm-hmm. I understand. So now talking about humans, in what ways do human societies differ from other mammal societies and perhaps more specifically other primate societies?
Well, I think it depends how deep one wants to go into this. I think one of the striking differences between human societies is concerned with cooperation between strangers.
Mm-hmm.
So most mammals that live in coherent groups defend their group or the area against unrelated females and unrelated individuals. Intruders are not welcome. Strangers are a danger. Yeah. Strangers are commonly attacked, not universally. Some species are quite pacific, and as I've told you, some groups will aggregate with each other. But there's typically considerable wariness of strangers. They are quite often attacked. In meerkats, for example, if you stray out of your range and you're caught, the neighbors will kill you. Chimpanzees will also kill neighbors, kill certainly males from neighboring communities. So lots of cases where there's pretty intense aggression between individuals from different groups. And I think at a sort of phenomenological level, we've got humans, not in all cases, as I'm sure you realize, but we have rules about how one deals with strangers. You don't get the sort of rules of hospitality that are common to so many human societies occurring in animal societies. So, I mean, taking that back to another level, that relates to human societies accepting social norms and to the presence of social contracts. So individuals, even if the social contracts are not actually written down, most societies have some sort of acknowledged grouping of ethics which says we behave to strangers in this way. In many cases, we welcome them. We behave to each other in that way, so that social contracts, some form of social contract, is common to human societies, and that's ultimately based on some form of agreement between members. So you and I agree that we'll Skype at a particular time or not, or something like. We'll agree on a way that we treat strangers, and quite commonly we in societies, those norms actually sort of generate into rules, and we try and make sure that all members of the society behave in roughly the same way and penalize individuals that do something quite different. Now, there are very few animal societies where anything like that occurs. So you don't get the norms. I mean, I can't think of, there are risks in trying to kill other members of your group in animal societies, but I can't think of any animal society that punishes members of groups where members of groups get together and punish an individual who murders another individual. There are, in many cases, dangers in attacking other individuals within the group, to individuals, because you may get killed yourself, or the individuals you're attacking may have a coalition with a third party, and you may suddenly face two individuals trying to kill you. So I'm not saying there are no dangers, but you tend, I can't think of anything which is similar to the kind of social group punishment of individuals that diverge and kill another individual. I think that that ultimately depends on some form. I mean, I'm using that as an extreme case, and the tendency for humans to punish individuals that do kill other individuals within the same group, at least in some circumstances, I think is related to the presence of social contracts, in the broadest sense of social contracts. And I suspect that social contracts that it's difficult to have social contracts without having some degree of language. You and I can agree on a social contract. Animals can't agree in the same way on a social contract. They can operate in the same way. So some individuals expect other individuals to behave in the same way, but there's no very specific agreement that if you do that, I will do that. There's an expectation, a probabilistic expectation, but not much more than that. So I tend to think that one of the important differences between human societies and animal societies is that animal societies don't have anything which is equivalent to the social contracts of humans.
Do human societies have one of those sorts of organizations? I mean, before I call them arrangements, but let's leave that term aside. Like one male, multi-female groups? Are they multi-male, multi-female, or?
Sorry, I'm not, can you just repeat? I didn't really follow that question.
Mhm. I was asking if human societies have any specific sort of organization, like, for example,
Okay.
multi-male, multi-female.
Okay. Well, in general, the commonest forms of the commonest social forms of who associates with human pairs. So some form of pair living is the commonest single form in humans, with very commonly societies consisting of multiple pairs. Having said that, monogamy, as we all know, is not strict, and in most societies, a proportion of breeding goes on outside the the accepted breeding pair. And in some societies, males have multiple breeding partners in an accepted fashion, and you move to polygyny. And in others, you have several breeding males associating with a single breeding female, particularly in some of the montane villages around the Himalayas, where resources are very short, and you have polyandry. So you've got a very wide range of human mating systems in there. They are averages. You probably, in any society, you may well get examples of polyandry and polygyny and monogamy in the same in the same population. But in general, I think the social anthropologists would say that pair living and monogamy was the commonest form of breeding system in humans. The substantial number of societies are polygynous, but in all cases, in virtually all cases, there are exceptions within particular societies. So you don't want to think of particular breeding systems as being encoded in the DNA or anything like that. We're dealing with much more flexible circumstances than that.
Mm-hmm. So, are humans a philopatric species?
Yeah. There's considerable discussion about that, whether they're, I'm not a social anthropologist, so I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask about that. I think as far as I can see, the general argument is that one may get, in many cases, they may get both. There are quite a lot of societies where basically women transfer. So there's, compared to non-human mammals, there are a surprising number of societies where females actually move to other breeding groups. Yeah, but both occur, and one gets societies where both occur in the same society, with both males and females leaving their normal breeding groups. So I think it's very flexible.
Mm-hmm. Does any other animal, not animal, sorry, a mammal society have culture?
Oh yes. Masses of animal societies have culture. If by culture one means that members of a group share some common behavior which has been learned from other members of the group, and there's divergence between groups, so that there's wonderful work on orangs, so that in different populations they learn to open particular fruit in different ways. There's work with Japanese macaques, which shows that some groups learn the technique of washing sweet potatoes and others don't. And the groups that do it, that spreads throughout the whole group. We've looked at that for meerkats. And the only thing we can find with meerkats is some groups get up early in the morning and others get up later in the morning. So presumably everyone's learned in some groups that, you get up and that's good for you and you get the first resources, and in others believe it's better to stay in bed. So I think culture is very common. I don't think culture necessarily requires any very high level of cognitive abilities. It requires the ability to learn from the individuals around you. And if you can learn or coincide your behavior with the other individuals around you, then you get a divergence of behavior between groups, which is what we call culture. Yeah. Culture can have major consequences then. So you can get those cultural differences growing, and those cultural differences, as people have argued, probably play a huge role in generating the kinds of social contracts that I was talking about earlier. And social contracts may have a major effect on differences in society. So as you move to humans, you move, I think, to a very different evolutionary regime, and you move to ones where differences in learning and differences in social agreements and differences in social contracts can have a major effect on both on the survival of groups and the survival of individuals. And you move to a situation where group selection, it's called cultural group selection, may well be very important. So I think as you move to humans, you move to circumstances where the relative importance of different evolutionary mechanisms may vary considerably from other animals. So I tend to, in general, emphasize the differences between humans and other animals rather than the similarities. There are quite a lot of, the world tends to be divided into people who point out the similarities between humans and other animals. I tend to point out the differences. There are both differences and similarities, and in a sense, it depends on what point you're wanting to make. It depends what you're arguing as to whether you emphasize the similarities between humans and other social animals or the differences.
Mm-hmm. So one final question, but talking still about culture, how do you look at the relationship between culture and biology, or is culture a biological phenomenon?
Well, culture is a biological phenomenon. I mean, in animal terms, I don't think there's no problem. Culture is in a sense a consequence of social learning, and social learning ultimately depends on what goes on inside your head. So it certainly has a partially biological basis. Is it the case that differences in culture are generated by natural selection? Not necessarily. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So differences in culture don't necessarily increase the lifetime breeding success of individuals, or necessarily of any of all individuals in the group. It may quite commonly increase the breeding success of the small number of individuals that monopolize most of the resources. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't necessarily increase the common good and the average breeding success. I think the thing that I find, in a sense, more revealing is that culture commonly has a substantial effect on biological processes. So the way in the influence, the circumstances under which biological processes operate are liable to be strongly affected by culture. To take very simple explanations, the simple examples, the culture depends on what affects what you find stressful. The culture you've been brought up in is likely to affect what you find stressful, is consequently likely to affect the influence of particular social events in your society on your cortisol levels or your sex hormone levels, and so on. So that culture modifies the effect of the environment on biological processes like hormone production, and hormonal levels in turn can affect behavior. So I think one of the seriously interesting areas here, which I suspect will become extremely important in the long run, is to explore how social circumstances in humans and cultural circumstances affect biological mechanisms with downstream consequences, both of a short term for behavior and indeed a long term for development and health and survival. So I think that the cultural processes have major consequences. And one of the unfortunate reasons, I think, why those have not been more explored, and I think those effects are widespread and are very important, but they're running from culture to biology, not from biology to culture. One of the reasons they haven't is the awful divide between social scientists and natural scientists, which has developed over the last 100 or so years. And I think that I terribly much hope that the next 50 years we'll see social science and biology coming together and exploring the areas where they both coincide and the processes which require you to understand both social processes in a sociologist sense and biological processes, because there are a lot of ways in which they affect each other.
Mm-hmm. And would that include things like gene culture coevolution?
Yes, that would those might involve that. You're then talking much more about the cases in which genetics actually affects natural selection. I was giving you cases where effectively culture affects the influence of the environment on your hormones, on short-term things that are not determined, that everything will have a genetic basis or some genetic basis in the long run. But the kinds of examples that I was giving you are cases where culture modifies the how you react to particular social or environmental events, and that has biological consequences which can affect your behavior or your responses or and so on. And I think that, I mean, for example, the kinds of your culture may well affect how pregnant women are affected by food shortage or by social instability of one kind or another. They may consequently affect maternal hormones. Maternal hormones affect the development of fetuses and can generate consequences that last throughout the individual's life. So I think we're going to find a lot of processes there where cultural differences have a major effect on development and on the subsequent behavior of individuals, which is in no way genetic. It's not, it's not a situation where you have anything like genetic determinism. It's actually a direct effect of culture on your physiology, on your hormone levels and so on, which has developmental effects, which are then difficult to escape. And I think there are lots of cases where people are going to, where effects of that kind are going to be found. We know of some, but I suspect they're very widespread. And that's why I think it's so important that social sciences and biological sciences should come together to get to understand that. And the argument that anyone who is interested in the interface between biology and human social behavior is necessarily a genetic determinist, I think is quite wrong. I think that there have been people who thought in that way in the past, but there are interactions between biology and social sciences and biology, which don't lead to genetic processes necessarily. There are some that may lead to genetic processes too, but there are many ways in which the society affects the development of individuals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Clutton-Brock, let's end the interview here. Just before we go, I will be leaving links in the description box to your work and also your book, Mammal Societies. Are there any places on the internet you would like to mention where people can find your work?
They can go to Google Scholar. The straightforward one of anyone doing that is to go to Google Scholar, and they'll get a listing of my work there. and they'll be able to see the abstracts to the work. Otherwise, probably Mammal Societies is the best reference.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Clutton-Brock, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. Please consider supporting the show. This show depends entirely on your support. So head to patreon.com/the Dissenter and consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, I also have links to PayPal in the description box of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Peruga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Fordans, Frederic Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Alan Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Nieberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Roy Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormer, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.